Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Damon Teepee, the host of today's webinar, Active Directory Threat Detection, Keep Your Organization in Business. We got a great topic and presentation prepared today where we'll dive a little deeper into how threats against AD are rising and what you can do to minimize and act early. With us today is Chaosoft founder Robert Boble, who I'll introduce in a moment. Before we get started, if everyone can take a quick moment to follow us on social media. You'll see on the screen here a QR code for each of your favorite social networks. With your phone's camera, you can scan the little box below and it'll take you directly to our social page. Please like and follow to stay connected, see our latest product updates, and get helpful industry news and content. A couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has an optimal listening experience. We do encourage you to ask questions and do so via the question or chat section in your webinar dashboard. Feel free to ask your question and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time, we'll reach out directly for follow-up. The session is being recorded and we'll email you a link in the following days. Real quick, I just wanted to make you aware that we are hosting a sister webinar to this one. It's focused more on product demonstration and really showing how our solution operates. So mark your calendars for May 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern. All right, now that we've gotten all of that taken care of, let's jump in. Today, we have the founder of Chaosoft, Robert Boble, who is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. With more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity industry, he has tons of insights, experiences, and best practices to share. You're in great hands today. On that note, I'll pass it over to Bob.
Hey, thank you, Damon. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out today. Want to make sure we start with sort of the very basic starting point, and that is, we're talking about threat detection for Active Directory, but why is Active Directory important? And in particular, why is hybrid Active Directory important? Well, I think the percentage on the left-hand side of my slide sort of says it all. Currently, about 70 to 75% of all enterprises use hybrid Active Directory as their primary identity store, which means it's the primary way that employees around the world sign in to computer resources that are controlled by Active Directory. And when we use the term hybrid, we refer to Active Directory on-premise being synchronized with Azure Active Directory in the cloud. And so now it's become one of the most popular ways to control access to not only Microsoft Cloud resources, but other third-party resources that might be on the internet or might be on-premise. It's the number one way businesses control network access. It represents really the keys to your kingdom in terms of what your digital assets are, and sometimes go beyond just the digital assets to physical assets. Quite often you will see door badges or other types of physical devices that control physical access connected to Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. If you're inside of Active Directory and you have the ability to read the information within the directory itself, it can also act as a treasure map to show you where access has been granted and to what users or to groups that may enjoy that access. And so anybody who's attacking Active Directory not only potentially can control the user accounts, but also see where they should be exercised, which makes it extremely critical as a place that needs to be secured and well maintained. Hybrid Active Directory, as I mentioned, is just simply a synchronization between the on-premise legacy Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory. But the real purpose of hybrid Active Directory is to extend the legacy on-premise Active Directory's authority to Microsoft Office, to Azure, as a centralized place for controlling network access to legacy resources and cloud resources in a modern architecture. This means if all access for an organization is controlled through hybrid Active Directory, when Active Directory is down or when Azure Active Directory is unavailable, the entire organization can cease to operate, and you have to prepare ahead of time to make sure that hybrid Active Directory is protected. We worked with an organization called Pulse Research, which is now Gartner, and did a survey to find out what exactly the cost would be to an organization that lost hybrid Active Directory. And there were several items that came out of that survey. The most important one The number one answer given was that the organization would cease to operate if hybrid Active Directory were to go out. Additional answers were loss of revenue and loss of critical operation data like orders, vendor transactions, those types of things. But the number one answer was that the organization itself would stop operating. You can imagine if you simply cease operations, the costs, the upset customers, the vendors who can't complete their work, all of those things would come to bear and cause quite a bit of expense and reputation loss. So we wanted to explain why that makes it valuable in terms of a target. Well, if it is going to control the entire access to an organization and that organization ceases to operate if it's not available, it goes to reason that an attacker could use this in a ransomware situation to extort money from the victim organization. And there are several different well-known ransomware attacks that have been perpetrated over the last several years that follow this model. In some cases, it's not ransomware. It is a simple attack to deny service of the directory, not for financial gain, but maybe political or tactical advantage. And we'll see an instance of that here in a few moments. Occasionally, you'll also see situations where it could be a schema change has been made to the directory and a corruption is propagated through, and you might need to recover that way, or it might cause an outage that way. But typically nowadays it's ransomware because the profit motivation is one of the strongest reasons to attack Active Directory. Once you have stolen the keys to the kingdom, you can charge whatever you want to try and get it back. Now, in this particular case on your screen, it's one of the scarier screens that people can see if you're a Windows system administrator. This is one of those ransomware attacks. Sometimes they're a little fancier. Here's another example of what those things look like when they get a hold of your servers, reboot your server, and that's what you're staring at. A non-functioning Windows machine sitting there with a extortion note up on the screen. So what are your responses in this case? Well, some people just say, well, our insurance will pay for that. In a lot of cases, insurance companies are no longer paying out these claims. It started to get to a point where the cyber attackers were evaluating the victim organization, determining what their insurance levels were, and then that would be the amount of the extortion, the amount shown in the ransomware screen. And in some cases, because of the costs going up so much, there are a lot of organizations now that will refuse to negotiate with the cyber attacker. And so their motivation is they're going to lose everything unless they're prepared and have some way to ensure that they'll get through these types of either ransomware attacks or wiperware attacks. The key to the response is you have to prepare ahead of time. You really need to implement a solution that guarantees your ability to recover as the worst case scenario might play out. You may get hit with this. Even better, if you prepare ahead, you might be able to defend against most of these things. But remember, an attacker has to be right one day of the year to compromise your environment, but you have to be right every day of the year. And so preparing is one of those ways you can set up a cyber defense to minimize the possibility that your environment will be taken offline. You need to really consider implementing things that go well beyond native tools. So the Active Directory platform itself just isn't enough. The Azure Active Directory management interface just isn't enough. You need things like continuous change monitoring, and you need to make your directories highly available, which means backup and recovery may not be enough. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So if you don't believe me that this is a big problem, here is a slide that demonstrates multiple organizations over the past several years that have been compromised. And these are extremely high profile, very expensive compromises that have happened because somebody has attacked Active Directory, Microsoft's infrastructure or Microsoft platforms, and used them as leverage for whatever purpose they might have had, whether it was extortion or denial of service in a tactical or political initiated event. These continue to happen. This year, there have been additional very high profile attacks. but Microsoft directories are complex to manage efficiently. And so sometimes things get neglected or people aren't paying enough attention, and so they make good targets. The built-in native monitoring capabilities are not very good. They do some event log information kind of output, but that can be missing and lacking for various reasons. It puts Active Directory in a situation where there are lots of different ways that you can force a denial of service attack on the environment. So it becomes maybe unavailable just periodically. If they take the directory offline completely with something like a ransomware or wiperware attack, then there are additional ramifications there. But just disrupting Active Directory can actually be fairly easy to accomplish. The number of settings is vast within Active Directory. The different areas and complexities of the architecture itself make it what we call porous and give a lot of different attack surfaces and different paths that people can take through the product to affect it negatively in some way. It is very difficult to recover, and Microsoft provides no solution to recover the directory. And in a ransomware attack, your Active Directory on-premise has to be recovered because it controls access to everything else. And without it, you can't grant access to other services or databases or data that you may have recovered as well. Now, these are sort of high profile. The one that is really, they're all sad, but last May, Lincoln College, which had been a higher educational institution for 157 years, was hit with ransomware. They did not get lucky and have an extra domain controller or an offline DC that they would try to even attempt to recover. They ended up shuttering the college. Here in Westerville, Ohio, our university, local university, Otterbein University, was hit, and it took them quite a long time. I think it was about 6 to 8 months to recover. In addition to that, during that process, the pandemic hit them, so they had a double whammy, and it made it extremely difficult to get anything accomplished. That's way too long. So these are sort of some high levels, but let's take a look at a very specific case. I really have to give credit where credit's due. Maersk was very good, and when they got hit with a ransomware attack, they didn't hide it. They used that as an opportunity to let everybody know just how bad things were. A little bit of background on them. They're the world's largest shipping company. So oftentimes you'll see a big lake freighter or an ocean freighter, and they'll have these big containers on them, and on the side it'll say Maersk. They got hit with NotPetya, and within 7 minutes, it had wiped out 55,000 devices connected to their Active Directory. All of their applications were offline, and most critically, the system that they used to book ships was down, which meant their core business was stopped. They couldn't add any new bookings for shipping items, and that's what they do as a business. They had one domain controller out of 147 of their Active Directory domain controllers that survived. That was the starting point for the recovery. It took them going through a manual recovery with an offline domain controller, a domain controller, 9 days. So if you think an offline domain controller or a lag domain controller is the way to go, this is basically what they ended up doing. And it took them 9 days. Their CIO slept in the office for 70 days. And so 9 days just to get their user accounts back up and working. That didn't include any of those other 1,200 applications. I'm sure they were working on them simultaneously, but they had to get Active Directory going before anything else would work. Their public filing showed about $350 million in losses that first year alone. So this was a very expensive proposition. And you can imagine if you're in a competitive industry and you can't take orders, but your competitor can, there's probably a lot more than $350 million in direct losses. The indirect losses are incalculable. Many companies that are in very tight margin industries where the profit margins are low would not have survived. So what are some things that we can do to find out what these risks are and then mitigate them? And this is where we start to talk about protecting your Microsoft identities with identity threat detection and response. Now, this identity threat detection and response term isn't a term we just invented. There are a lot of folks using it, but I would point to Gartner as being sort of the leader in this space. in that they have an area of research that they dedicate to identity threat detection and response. And Active Directory is one of the largest portions of that research and information that they've gathered. So what exactly is identity threat detection and response? Well, it's actually a series of technologies that revolve around looking at user identity and corporate identities and making sure that they're highly available. And so that's an important concept that we're going to discuss. So let's talk a little bit about identity threat detection. We're going to break this into two pieces. Let's talk about identity threat detection first, then we'll talk about what the response is when a threat is found. I love the dog sniffing the suitcase. This is kind of the detection part, and I thought that was really sort of an appropriate image to throw out there. Because just like a dog sniffing for bombs or drugs or some risk that may be introduced into the travel process, you need to do the same thing. And figuring out what those risks are is a big part of this battle, right? So the first thing just be unwanted changes. So you might want to think about this as continuous change detection. You have to look at Active Directory as sort of being two pieces. There's the infrastructure that Active Directory provides, which is your domain controllers, your sites, your services, the replication between domain controllers. Those are sort of what we would call the standing rigging on a sailboat, right? That's the pieces that are there even when it's not operational. It just has to be implemented in order for the whole thing to work. And then you have what we would on a sailboat call running rigging, which is the data within the database itself, within the Active Directory. Those are your users and your groups, your permissions. And if you're talking about Azure Active Directory, there are roles, right? You have roles and you have contacts and you have devices. That's all the data within the database itself. So when I talk about monitoring for security drift and suspicious changes, what I'm talking about is somebody goes in and they change the membership of a group. And because groups are the most common way that access is controlled, granted or revoked, if they add somebody to that group, they're granting somebody access to something that may be not authorized to have that access. It could also be that they go straight into the directory and they change the permissions that are on any of those things I mentioned, objects. Those are controlled through something called an access control list, very technical, but it's actually the read write permissions and listing permissions on the objects within the directory itself. It could be also another, unwanted change. They might go into group policy, and group policies control the configuration of user accounts and how they interact with machines, workstations, and it also controls the configuration of a workstation. And it also can do things like execute applications on workstations. So it could be a great way to transmit a ransomware. So those things have to be monitored very closely. The data within Active Directory has to be looked at from a change perspective so you can quickly identify suspicious changes, isolate them, and then remediate them, which is part two. We'll talk about that. So there's a second area to all of this, and that is just simply having the infrastructure of Active Directory. There are a number of things that have been shown, a number of settings in particular out of the vast number of settings that may not be optimal based on your situation when it comes out of the box, right? So as soon as the software is installed, things might not be just the way you should have them to make the environment secure. The environment isn't hardened by default. And so you have, maybe neglected to configure things that would make your environment more secure, or maybe you knew about them, but there's so many settings you've forgotten about them. So you might have changed them incorrectly in the past or not set them at all. And that opens up a bunch of risks and attack pathways that a cyber attacker, somebody who's savvy or understands how to use tools or do compromise, walk through a compromise can exploit. And so you need to be able to find those things. And we look at here at Chaosoft 3 different types of these risks. There's an exposure risk, and these are potentially exploitable attack points that may be misconfigurations or things that were just neglected, never hardened in the first place, never set up in the first place. Generally, these are called indicators of exposure. So you're exposed, the directory is exposed from a security standpoint somehow. The next one is indicator of a compromise. This is where you find something in the environment that is maybe a remnant or a leftover of an attack that might have occurred in the past. And then a lot of organizations also have this other thing, this indicator of an attack, and that just means something that's more active or real time. Like maybe there's a new account that an attacker has created in your environment and given it administrative permissions, and you find out that that account is being used. That's a real-time attack. It's actually happening. Or maybe something like they're spraying passwords at Active Directory, trying to find one that's the right password for a specific user account, but you know it's happening in the immediacy. And that's a little different from the indicators of compromise. It's very subtle, but a lot of times indicators of compromise would be something like, hey, there's an object that is out there. It alone can't do anything, but it indicates that somebody, for example, brought up a rogue domain controller, did something programmatically with it, and then shut it down, and they didn't clean it all up. So, or there's a series of settings that would only occur if there was an attack that had been perpetrated in the past. And so you have indicators of these risks, and you need to look at them as a risk. Hopefully you catch them when they're just exposed and not after you've been compromised or you find out you're actively being attacked. But the idea is that you have to look at these things to detect them. Now, how does that work? Well, there are several systems out there that will have what I think of as kind of like an antivirus signature. It's oftentimes a script. It could be PowerShell script. It could just be something that reads information from Active Directory or reads the configuration of a certain area of the product or group policy. And then if certain parameters within that information line up, that might indicate that you have a risk that's an exposure, maybe evidence of a compromise, or maybe you find something that means there's an ongoing attack. But those signatures, you can think of those as like an antivirus signature, right? That's how antivirus products work. And so threat detection tools have those definitions, and then they execute those against the environment looking for these things. Now, this is different from just monitoring for change, because it may be that these things are already in the environment. They're not changing. Nobody changed the setting. It was just never configured properly in the first place. This is a little different from detecting, monitoring for changes and security drift, in that those are things that people are going into actively, like your administrators, and making changes and removing people from groups or adding people to groups, and you can watch those changes, and that the changes themselves trigger examination. These IOCs, IOEs, and IOAs likely are things that are static, that are sitting there, and you have to know to go look for them. There's nothing to trigger you to investigate them without having a tool, or know that you need to look at those. Now, speaking of some tools, I want to mention some free tools that will help you look for vulnerabilities within Active Directory. These are a little bit more modern than maybe some of the ones you've seen in the past. We, Chaosoft, have a product called Chaosoft Guardian, and Chaosoft Guardian has threat protection solution built into it. And you can think of it as antivirus for your identities. Think of it that way. It's a great way to sort of look at what we do. It's a free part of the product. You install our product. It reaches out to our online update, downloads signatures for known IOEs, IOCs, and IOAs, and then it scans your environment. And that's all part of our solution to help you prevent the compromises from occurring. And by the way, we also give in that product a change history, a log of all changes that were observed in the environment for the previous 2 weeks. So you get 2 weeks of change history at no charge, and then you also get threat protection. It's a great tool. Then we have Bloodhound. And with Bloodhound, this is another great free tool. Just go to the internet and search for these things. You'll find them, no problem. But with Bloodhound, it lets you visualize attack paths or how people could compromise Active Directory. And effectively, once you install the software, and that may be a little tricky, you might have to work at that a little bit. But once you get the software installed, you can export your Active Directory data, bring it in, and it'll give you a visual representation of how people might compromise your directory. And then the last one mentioned here is a command line tool a lot of folks use, and it helps you determine what your security posture is by allowing you to look at specific things within the directory to make sure that you're properly protected. But again, I'll just mention our tool, Chaosoft Guardian Threat Protection. It's free, part of the product. So even if you decide you're not going to buy the commercial version, you can continue on. There's only one version, and it automatically updates threats on an ongoing basis, just like an antivirus product would. We help you cover your environment and protect it faster than other solutions you might have to uninstall and reinstall. Those types of tools will also help you overcome some of the inherent limitations. That's why they exist. Some of the inherent limitations of the native Active Directory products. Let me give you one major example of a limitation. In addition to just sort of the interfaces themselves, right? The management tools. One big limitation is the way changes are tracked within Active Directory. There's this directory logging or event log service that you have to make sure is working, but then the programmers, anytime a change is made, they insert a line of code that throws an event, a little piece of information out to the Windows event log, and that's how changes are tracked. Now, there's a little more to it than that, but those events, they can be a little cryptic. If the programmer were to forget to or decides they don't want to throw an event, no events generated. So there are some gaps that may come along. But more importantly to that, and since we're talking about threat detection and trying to protect your environment from cyber attack, you don't want to rely on event data because it's almost always the first target in a cyber attack, so that the attacker can blind the system to the changes that he or she is making to further the attack. And so event logs are notoriously bad for trying to understand how to protect the environment, and then also understanding what's actually happening within the environment. Unfortunately, most SIEM tools that you may have already invested in or legacy Active Directory change auditing tools, they rely on events. Or they use a scheme that may be a little bit better for events, but only works maybe for the legacy Active Directory and doesn't work in the cloud. And so those native limitations for event data, it's just not good enough. So keep in mind, you're probably going to need something that goes well beyond event data because of the potential for it to be compromised and the fact that it's not a complete picture. And so part of the limitations of the out of the box Active Directory is just it doesn't give you enough information. So let's talk about what do you do to respond. So you find a change in the Active Directory data. Somebody has stripped the group membership for an important group so that a bunch of users can no longer access an application. How do you mitigate that? Well, you're going to roll it back, right? That's a pretty obvious thing. So undoing, unfortunately, doesn't exist in Microsoft's Active Directory. They do have a recycle bin, but guess what? That doesn't really undo. It's just an undelete. It's all they give you. So you're kind of left on your own. So there's a couple things that you need to think about. So let's start down our list here talking about resolving IOEs, IOCs, and IOAs. Those are the risks that might be detected by threat detection software. Almost all the time, you're going to either personally or within your group or within your organization attempt to mitigate those or resolve them manually. Oftentimes, it's not one single setting that needs to be changed. It might be a series of settings. Those series of settings may have an impact on how the infrastructure works, how Active Directory works. And so you may find that the vast majority of these things can't have a quick answer. You need to unwind them by going through a series of steps. Now, any good threat detection tool that indicates there's an existence of one of these IOEs or IOCs should give you information on how to resolve it. In some cases, if they're simple resolutions, some of these tools, like our tool, actually gives you a button to roll it back. If it's a simple change, if it's a more complex change, then typically guidance is provided. But the great thing is we have this newfangled thing called the internet, and I will tell you, if you found a DC shadow indication that there's a DC shadow attack in your environment, you can go look it up and you will find the information you need to understand what's going on. There are also a really large number now of security consultancies that specialize not just in Active Directory, but other types of identity security and protecting those things. But we highly recommend finding one of those groups, even if you're just following them on Twitter or reading their news feed. Awareness is a big part of this battle. So we highly recommend a lot of those folks. And in fact, even within our tool itself, we put a list right in the resolution section of each threat we detect that links over to our partner page, so you can go out and find people that might be interesting or may work in your area of interest. Maybe they're specializing in healthcare or whatever, manufacturing, whatever it might be. But there's a list of consultants there that can help you with your Active Directory security. If it's a simple change, somebody changed a group policy incorrectly, groups got incorrectly modified. Let's say somebody wrote a script and cleared all your groups out. That could be kind of onerous because you may not be able to determine easily what actually changed from the event data, especially if they've wiped out your event data. And so that could disable application access through anything that's using groups as their mechanism for assigning application access. So you definitely want to be doing change monitoring, take that data, and then sit there and you can manually roll it back by reading event data if you have it, or maybe you've documented your environment. I mean, we all, print out who's in each group, right? No, nobody does that. It's just not. There are several great Active Directory data backup and recovery tools. Guardian has that built into it in our commercial product. There's Quest and Cyberattacks both have that capability. Whether it works hybrid is a different story, and whether it covers all the object types and data types is a different story. You really have to be careful on how you select those things, but there are tools out there to help you with that and make that an easier process. Finally, there's this other thing, worst case scenario, somebody does compromise your environment. Now, it could be a persistent compromise or a persistent threat where they're just in the environment and they're lurking, right? And this happens all the time. Somebody will compromise a workstation. They'll then move laterally to gaining administrative control over a domain controller, and then they'll wait inside your environment and they'll keep doing reconnaissance and figuring out exactly, and then one day they let loose with their ransomware attack or whatever attack they might have. If you catch them while they're lurking in the environment, you might want to have an alternate version of your Active Directory. You turn off the first one and go to your new one. If they've already attacked you and all your domain controllers come up with a ransomware message, you're not going to have a choice. You're going to have to move to a recovered environment. We obviously recommend Chaosoft Guardian Forest Recovery. It's the same product. It's our commercial product. But in any case, there are other companies out there that do this as well. And the real key here is you really probably don't want to rely on a replicated DC that you kind of hide in the corner, because it'll cause problems with the hybrid connection out to Azure potentially. It may not have the most up-to-date data, so you could have issues there. Could be also infected. They just haven't executed it yet on that side. But with any of these tools that you're going to use, you can't think of recovery after the fact. You have to plan your response ahead of time. inaction is the thing that will kill you every single time. So if it's a third-party recovery tool, it has to be implemented ahead of time. If it's a third-party recovery through high availability tool like our tool, it has to be implemented ahead of time. Even if you're going to try and do it natively with the instructions Microsoft gives you, they don't give you a tool. They give you a 48-page or 58 article website that explains how you might be able to do it. All that requires upfront planning and work. And those changes, if you're relying on having an extra domain controller like Maersk did, recovery can take a long time. As you saw with Maersk, it took them 9 days just to get AD back online. So why is this process take so long? Well, the answer is because forest recovery is complex, and it's sort of the last worst case scenario, right? So if you don't get threat detection and response to those threats correctly, and you don't defend your environment, then you have to recover your environment, right? And so the worst thing to have to do is hit the button to recover your environment, because when you're in that mode, the nerves, start building up. The hair on the back of your neck's going to stand up. The employees are going to be screaming at you, I can't do my job. Management's going to be screaming at you. And so having to recover is the absolutely worst time to have to actually push the button to do recovery. And most administrators that have gone through this will tell you that that is the piece they were most worried about, because with most solutions, you're not sure it's going to work until you actually are successful or fail the recovery. But it's very time consuming. It can be, very costly, because you have to maybe go get new machines, hardware or VMware licenses. A lot of pre-planning and effort, especially if you're going to try and do it the native way, which is all manual and step by step. In each domain in your forest, there's a long list of tasks. We kind of have it over here on the right. You have to plan that. And then, not only do you have all these things to do in each domain, or all these steps to do, there's a lot of other questions that you have to live with too. Do you understand all the steps that you've been, asked to do? How often are you going to be able to test this? If it's, if you're doing it manually, you may not be able to test it more than once a year because of the complexity and the disruption it causes. Do you have a machine that's backed up? Do you know what DCs in each environment you're going to need, right? You have to have DCs for each domain. Is DNS running in Active Directory integration? Is it through Active Directory integrated mode, or is it external? How are you going to recover external DNS? What order are you going to rebuild in? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. This is just a couple of the questions. And again, I mentioned Microsoft gives you some guidance, but it's just a website, so there's no recovery tools from them. It's just a bunch of information telling you what you should have done ahead of time to try and give yourself the best chance. So the number one thing I would leave you with here is that forest recovery is, when all else fails, you don't want your recovery to fail. And there's a high likelihood, even with proper planning, if you're trying to do it manually or use tools, if you're doing a traditional backup and recovery, you're trying to do the process Microsoft explains, or if you're trying to script it, there is a likelihood that one of those legacy methods is going to fail. And that's because setting everything up is very complex. You have to have a set of recovery servers or VMs pre-allocated. That means those, in addition to your original online, production directory, those things have to be backed up. They have to be updated and maintained. You have to make sure the backups are not broken. They're not also infected. And the problem with the recovery and, in the backup and recovery process is that you have to do the recovery when everybody's screaming at you. And you only test that once or twice a year. So you struggle to get it to work, if it works at all, and you're set up for failure. So what we recommend is that you look at a better alternative to backup and recovery, and that is what we call instant forest recovery, through a fault-tolerant method rather than a backup and then restoring those backups to physical machines or VMs one at a time. And the reason we recommend this is it's extremely simple, it's easy to set up and use, and it's virtually 100% reliable. It does an automatic recovery, and that recovery is really cloning your directory, taking your production directory and creating a clone of that in either Amazon AWS or in Azure Active Directory. It uses what we call clean backup technology, in that it doesn't take the operating system, which is where the ransomware, wiperware, or other malware is going to be hiding and lurking and infecting that computer. So it's not going to fail right off the bat like a VMware, it's like, sorry, Veeam or Commvault or whoever, those legacy server-based snapshot backups do. And the backups are very, very small, so they move quickly across to the cloud version of your on-premise legacy directory. And the best part is it doesn't take you days or hours or months or weeks. It's virtually instant, because really what you do is you just make some adjustments to your routing and you're done. So how does this actually work? Well, the idea here is to minimize the damage an outage would cause and do the fastest recovery possible. I don't believe there is a faster recovery. So if you see one of the other 80 backup vendors telling you that they have the fastest, it's baloney. There's no way you can beat this. We've patented it. It's going to be the fastest way to do it. So the idea is that you have to set up what we call these clean backups, and we help you pick out 2 DCs typically per domain, and that's your production forest on the left. And then you basically say, okay, on a schedule, you're going to grab those backups, and then maybe once a day or every couple of days, it'll automatically recover and construct an isolated recovery forest for you. And that isolated forest we call standby forests. And so you can have those in Amazon or AWS, doesn't matter. You can do them on-prem too, but it's a little more complex and confusing. So we recommend Amazon or AWS. But it creates these automatic recovery sites. And so it works because every day it runs, or night or 2 days or whatever your schedule is, it takes your existing environment and clones it and starts it and proves that it works. So you don't have to freak out if you ever have an outage. You just have to flip the switch. Now, what do I mean by flip the switch? So what I mean by flip the switch is when you do have your production forest go out, you simply go to your routing information, your switch, your network router, and you redirect your authentication traffic from your legacy environment. You shut all those DCs down. Those boxes are they're compromised anyway, and they're sitting there blinking their ransomware note. You shut all those down. They're now isolated and ready for forensics to be run, maybe by the FBI or whoever law enforcement agency or consultant that you're working with. Your network traffic gets rerouted, and those routes only take a couple of seconds to update. So the big thing is you have to be prepared to update the route to reroute your user login traffic across your express route or whatever high-speed connection you have to your cloud platform. And the cool part is you don't have to do just one of these. You can have 5 of these. You can have one every day for the last 5 days. On the 6th day, we'll create a new one, and we'll get rid of the one that was created 7 days ago or however many days ago. So this is what we call instant forest recovery. Very quick. It creates a fault-tolerant version of your environment in the cloud where it can't easily be compromised. And because we're using what we call clean backups, we can do the recovery without reintroducing the ransomware like you would likely have happen with Veeam or Commvault or any of those other legacy backup vendors that sometimes claim they can do Active Directory backup and recovery, but in reality, they're just doing server backup and recovery, and so you're not going to have a successful recovery in a ransomware situation with them. So let's give you kind of a quick update comparing third-party directory solutions. If you're trying to use a Rubrik, a Commvault, those traditional folks in the backup world, they do a great job, don't get me wrong, for what they do, but you're likely going to be days or weeks. You're using the traditional legacy Active Directory tools from either Quest or Cyberattacks. It might be hours, could be a day. You're down to minutes with us, which is kind of cool. the chance that you're going to have a failure with those, VMs and convaults, the legacy or general backup vendors, extremely high. It's likely you will not be successful, and that includes also the potential for not being able to restore with things like the Microsoft native functionality or trying to do scripting. Quest, it's medium, Cyberattacks medium, simply because you don't know it'll work until you actually go to do it. And even if you test once a year, a couple times a year, because the machines, in your production environment and your recovery computers, whether they're VMs or physical machines, those things have to be maintained. And if you maintain them incorrectly, it's possible they're not available or ready when you go to need them during an emergency. With Chaosoft Instant Force Recovery, it's going to work. Recovery testing is done automatically in these high availability, and it's continuous. So every time a new isolated recovery lab is built, it's tested. It's going to work. With Active Directory, the Active Directory focused recovery tools, you might test them 2 or 3 times a year. I want to say 60-some% of people using directory recovery recover less than quarterly. And then finally, do you need to build AD servers themselves with the general backup solution and the Active Directory focused solutions? You have to, so it makes it a little difficult. So let me give you an idea of what we're talking about. Guardian is the base product that provides the free threat detection. We also have a commercial version which provides change monitoring, real-time alerting of changes that you might not want to see. So if you select your VP of HR's account, you can say any changes to that account, notify me because I want to check it. Should never be changed. CEO's account, never change. So you have a VIP list of people, never change. We do have instant rollback, meaning if a change is detected to any of the Active Directory data, to conditional access policies, security parameters, group policies, we can have those automatically rolled back. That's in those situations where something should never occur. We do recover objects and attribute data. I mentioned the free threat detection, and we also do group policy monitoring and rollback. Fully hybrid from the start. We offer, as part of the free threat detection, 2 weeks of change history as well, which means you can see changes that were made both on-premise and cloud. So if you create a user or change a user on-premise and it synchronizes to the cloud, you will see both changes. We also do hybrid recovery. So if you go to recover an object or data that's associated with it, and it has some impact on premise or on the opposite side in the cloud, we automatically take care of that as well. Then we have Guardian Forest Recovery. It's the same product, it's just a different license key. Exactly the same product, a different license key. It allows you to extend change monitoring, threat detection, to also include response. So one solution for on-premise Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and also Office 365. We do threat detection, we do change monitoring for suspicious changes, we provide full data rollback of the metadata, and in hybrid recovery mode, and you now with, as they say, for a few dollars more, you can license the instant forest recovery. And by the way, this has a really kind of a cool thing. The real-time alerts can be done by email, they can be done in our console, but we also integrate with Microsoft Teams so that you can see the changes, and then what we do internally is claim them. So if we make a change, we could say, hey, that was me. It's kind of a great way to just foster communication. And then finally, we have something called Chaosoft Administrator. This is a proxy administration tool for Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. It's full hybrid, but this allows you to protect from other types of threats like insider attacks, where people are trusted to do the right thing, but they may do things that they shouldn't be doing because they've become upset or they just simply make mistakes. So this allows you to protect Active Directory from the people within your organization, and it also lets you deal with the permission bloat problem that the native permission model pretty much guarantees you're going to have. We also do Office 365 license optimization to show you where you can save money. We do Microsoft Teams and the phone number management within that in this tool, automated user provisioning, deprovisioning, and full-blown delegation to help desk or to day-to-day administrators. It's a single console, it's hybrid, and it also provides a layer of governance that goes not just for the cloud, but also on-premise. So if you want attestation or self-service group management that covers everything in your environment, you can come to Chaosoft Administrator. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Damon to walk us out.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. This kind of concludes our presentation today. We'd like to thank everyone for their time. Hope you enjoyed the webinar and Bob's insights here. You'll see on the screen a few quick links for the Chaosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, like to schedule a personalized demo, get a quote, sample us via a free trial, as Bob mentioned earlier, you can follow the links on the screen. Again, thank you for your time, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.